The parcel was sitting at an angle. That was the first thing Watson noticed. Not its size, not its wrapping, not even the fact that it was there at all on the second step of 221B Baker Street at 6:30 on a November evening. It was the angle. Tilted perhaps 15 degrees to the left, resting against the iron boot scraper as though it had been set down in haste, and not quite straightened again. A small thing, the sort of detail most men would not register, walking home in the cold with their collar turned up and their thoughts already drifting toward supper. But Watson had spent enough years in the company of Sherlock Holmes to know that small things had a habit of mattering enormously. He paused on the pavement, one foot raised on the step, and looked at it properly. It was wrapped in brown paper, the ordinary sort, the kind sold in rolls at any stationer's or grocer's, tied with a length of dark red ribbon that had been knotted once, neatly, and then a second time, as though the person tying it had second-guessed themselves. The paper was damp along the bottom edge from where it had rested against the step, which meant it had been there for some time, an hour, perhaps more. The address written on the front was in a careful, deliberate hand, the letters formed with the self-conscious tidiness of someone who did not write often and wished to make a good impression when they did. But the address itself was wrong, not slightly wrong, not a transposed digit or a misspelled street, entirely wrong. The name read Mr. E. Calloway, 14 Dorset Rise, Farringdon. Watson lived at 221B Baker Street, and knew no one by that name. He picked it up. It was lighter than he expected, and it shifted as he lifted it, the contents moving against each other with a soft, papery rustle, the sound of many thin sheets rather than one. Something inside clinked very faintly. Not glass, not metal. Something small and dense, perhaps a button or a seal, rolling loose among the pages. The fog was coming in from the north that evening, as it so often did in November, rolling down from the direction of Regent's Park in long, slow ribbons that caught the gas lamplight and held it, diffusing it into a general amber glow that softened every edge and muffled every sound. The street was quieter than usual. A hansom cab passed at the far end of Baker Street, its horses' hooves muffled by the damp, its single lamp a smear of gold in the murk. Somewhere a few streets over, a church bell was beginning its 7 o'clock sequence, not urgently, not dramatically, but with the patient, measured solemnity of something that had been counting the hours for centuries and intended to continue doing so for centuries more. Watson stood on the step with the parcel under his arm and listened to the bells until they finished. Then he went inside. Mrs. Hudson was in the hallway, emerging from the direction of the kitchen with a small towel in her hands and an expression that suggested she had been expecting someone to ask her something, and was preemptively composing her answer. "That parcel," Watson said, holding it up as evidence. "Yes," she said. "A man brought it. I should say an hour ago. Perhaps a little more." "What sort of man?" Mrs. Hudson considered this with the thoroughness she applied to all questions asked in her hallway, which was considerable. "Older," she said finally. 60, perhaps. Thin, but not unhealthily so. The kind of thin that comes from being spare by nature, rather than from want. He wore a good coat, Dr. Watson, but it was old. The elbows were beginning, if you know what I mean. She demonstrated by touching her own elbow briefly, as though the word required illustration. Good boots, though. Kept up. He was particular about his boots. Did he say anything? He asked if this was the right dress for Mr. Holmes. I told him Mr. Holmes lived upstairs. He seemed not relieved exactly, more as though that confirmed something he'd already suspected. He handed me the parcel and said it needed to reach Mr. Holmes before the end of the week. Then he left. She paused. Quickly, not rudely, but quickly. Did he give his name? He did not. Watson looked at the parcel again. The address on it isn't this one. No, said Mrs. Hudson, with the equanimity of a woman who had long since made her peace with the fact that nothing that arrived at 221B Baker Street was ever entirely straightforward. I noticed that. Holmes was standing at the window when Watson came upstairs, which was unusual only in that he was doing nothing else simultaneously. No violin, no experiment, no monograph spread across 3 chairs. He was simply standing, looking out at the fog, with his hands clasped behind his back, and the particular quality of stillness about him that meant his mind was occupied somewhere Watson could not follow. The fire had been built up recently, the coals still settling, ticking softly as they shifted, and the room held that particular warmth of early evening in Baker Street. Pipe tobacco, old paper, a faint trace of the chemical compounds that clung stubbornly to the shelves, regardless of how thoroughly Mrs. Hudson aired the room. "You've been standing there for a while," Watson said. 22 minutes, Holmes said, without turning. "There is a man on the opposite pavement who has been watching this building. He is no longer there. He left approximately 4 minutes before you arrived, which suggests either that your approach along Baker Street was visible to him from his position, or that he had been waiting for a specific interval and chose to leave when it elapsed." He turned now, and his gaze dropped immediately to the parcel under Watson's arm, and his expression shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a compass needle shifts when it finds north. "That was delivered an hour ago. Mrs. Hudson told me. She described the man. 60 years of age, spare frame, good coat, in poor condition, excellent boots. He walked with a slight hesitation on the left side, not a limp, but a carefulness, as though the left knee occasionally protests on stairs or cold evenings. He stood on this pavement for perhaps 30 seconds after Mrs. Hudson took the parcel before deciding to leave." Holmes paused. He looked up at this window once, not furtively, almost apologetically. Watson set the parcel on the table. "You were watching from up here." "I was watching from up here." Holmes crossed to the table and looked at the parcel without touching it yet. His eyes moved across it with the methodical patience of a man reading a page in a language he knows well, but reads slowly out of respect for its complexity. Brown paper, standard weight, sold by the ream. The ribbon is interesting, dark red, moderately wide, the sort used for bundling legal documents or correspondence. It's been knotted twice. The second knot was tied differently from the first, tighter, more deliberate. Someone changed their mind about something between the first knot and the second. About sending it? Or about what to include? Holmes touched the ribbon now, running his thumb along the knot without untying it. The paper is damp at the base. An hour on a November step will do that. But the ribbon is dry, which means it was tied inside. The parcel was wrapped in shelter, many sheets of thin paper, and something. Many sheets of thin paper, and something small and loose, a seal, I think. Possibly more than one. He set it down again and looked at the address. Mr. E. Calloway, he read aloud. 14 Dorset Rise, Farringdon. A pause. There is no 14 Dorset Rise. Dorset Rise ends at number 11. The street is quite short, barely a lane, really, running between Farringdon Road and Saffron Hill. I walked it in 1887 in connection with a matter I shall not bore you with at this hour. So the address is invented. The address is constructed, Holmes said, which wasn't quite the same thing, and he said it in the tone that indicated the distinction mattered. Someone wrote an address that sounds entirely plausible, the sort of address a Farringdon clerk or small tradesman might have, without it being verifiable until someone actually attempts delivery. It is a delay mechanism. Whoever sent this did not want it arriving by post. They wanted it to sit, to wait, to arrive here specifically by hand in a way that left no postal record. Watson looked at the parcel with fresh attention. Why here? Why Holmes? Holmes did not answer immediately. He untied the ribbon, carefully preserving both knots intact on either side, and folded the brown paper back. Inside was a bundle of letters. Not a few. Perhaps 15 or 20, Watson thought, though it was difficult to be certain at a glance. They were of varying sizes, some the standard white envelopes of ordinary correspondence, some smaller, some larger, one sealed in a blue-grey envelope that was noticeably heavier paper than the rest. They were held together by a second piece of the same dark red ribbon, tied in the same double knot pattern. Each envelope was sealed. Each was addressed in a different hand, and lying among them, as though it had simply settled. There, during transport, was a small disc of red sealing wax, cracked cleanly through the middle, the two halves still holding the impression of a seal. The initials A.F., surrounded by a simple ring of small dots. Holmes picked up the cracked seal and held it to the lamplight. He did not speak for a long moment. "The wax is cold," he said at last, "but not old cold. This seal was broken recently, within the last few days, I should think. The crack is clean, not crumbled, which means the wax was still slightly pliable when it was opened. Winter wax becomes brittle and fragments. This was broken when the temperature was mild, indoors, probably in a room with a fire." He turned it over. "The initials are A.F., not E. Calloway, not anyone connected to that invented address. A.F., our sender, most likely. Why would the sender include his own broken seal?" Holmes set the disc down with the particular gentle precision he reserved for objects that were still telling him things. "Because," he said quietly, "he wanted us to know it had been opened before." Watson looked at the bundle of letters, 15 or 20 sealed envelopes in 15 or 20 different hands, none of them addressed to Sherlock Holmes, none of them addressed to 221 B. Baker Street, all of them brought here deliberately by an old man with good boots and an apologetic glance at an upstairs window. "These aren't his letters," Watson said slowly. "They're other people's." "They are letters that were never sent," Holmes said. He was looking at the bundle with an expression Watson found difficult to name. Not excitement. Holmes's excitement was a sharper thing, more electrical. This was quieter, more considered. "Look at the handwriting on the envelopes. None of them match. These were not written by one person. They were written by many, gathered, held, and now delivered here, by a man who did not give his name." Outside, the fog had deepened. The gas lamp at the foot of Baker Street was now a soft, diffused glow rather than a distinct point of light. The flame consumed by the murk, its warmth distributed into a general amber softness that lay against the windows like something almost affectionate. The coals in the fireplace shifted and settled. The clock on the mantelpiece marked a quiet half-hour. Somewhere in the kitchen below, the kettle had been put on. Watson could hear the faint, rising note of water beginning to warm, that particular sound that belonged to evenings in Baker Street, the way birdsong belonged to mornings in the country. Holmes did not reach for the bundle yet. He stood, looking at it, with his hands very still, which was itself a kind of information. Holmes, in the presence of a problem that engaged him, was rarely still. This stillness was something else. "One of these letters," he said at last, "is not like the others." Watson waited. "I don't know which one yet," Holmes said. He picked up the cracked seal again, turned it once in his fingers, and set it down on the table beside the ribbon and the folded brown paper. "But I intend to find out." The kettle began to sing downstairs, and Mrs. Hudson's footsteps moved across the kitchen floor, steady and unhurried, as they had moved across that floor for years. The fire crackled, the fog pressed softly against the glass, and on the table at 221B Baker Street, 15, or perhaps 20, the count was still uncertain, unsent letters waited in their dark red ribbon, each one holding its secret with the particular stubbornness of words that had been written and kept, and never, until now, given to the world. Watson pulled his chair a little closer to the fire. "You'd better sit down," Holmes said, though he himself remained standing. "This will take some time." It was, Watson reflected, settling into his armchair with the comfortable familiarity of a man in his own room on a cold evening. Not the worst way to spend a November night. The fog was outside, the fire was here. And somewhere in that bundle of letters, somewhere beneath the ribbon and the seals and the careful, troubled handwriting of strangers, something was waiting to be understood. He was, despite himself, curious. He was also, despite the faint unease that the cracked seal had placed somewhere just below his sternum, entirely comfortable. That was the particular gift of Baker Street on evenings like this one. It made curiosity feel safe. Mrs. Hudson brought the tea without being asked. This was not unusual. Mrs. Hudson had a gift, developed, Watson suspected, through long years of proximity to Sherlock Holmes, for knowing when tea was required before the people who required it had arrived at that conclusion themselves. She set the tray on the side table nearest the fire, arranged the cups with the quiet efficiency of someone who took small ceremonies seriously, and then stood for a moment, looking at the bundle of letters on the central table, with an expression that was not quite curiosity and not quite concern, but lived somewhere in the dignified territory between the two. "Shall I bring anything else?" she asked. "The evening, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said, which was his way of saying no, and she accepted it as such with the equanimity of long practice, and withdrew, pulling the door softly closed behind her. The room settled. Outside, the fog had completed its occupation of Baker Street with the thoroughness of a general who has studied the terrain. There was nothing to be seen through the window now but a soft, even amber. The combined glow of the gas lamps below diffused through the murk into something almost warm, almost gentle, as though the city were attempting to compensate for the cold with light. The sounds of the street had become muffled, intimate. The occasional knock of a cab horse's hooves, the distant call of a costermonger closing up his stall for the evening, the steady drip of condensation from the window ledge. London Inn. The fog was a different city from London in the clear, quieter, more inward, more willing to let its edges dissolve. Holmes had moved to his armchair, which was the first surprise. He was not pacing, not standing at the window, not performing the restless kinetic energy that usually accompany the early stages of a case. He sat with one knee crossed over the other and the bundle of letters in his lap, and he was looking at them, not reading them, simply looking, with the focused patience of a man attempting to hear something being said very quietly. Watson poured the tea. The act of pouring tea was, Watson had long believed, one of the most civilizing gestures available to human beings. The small weight of the pot, the particular sound of the stream, not a splash, but a continuous, quiet rush, the rising thread of steam, the colour spreading through the water like a slow thought. He handed Holmes his cup, without speaking. Holmes accepted it, without looking up. This was a normal transaction between them, worn smooth by repetition into something almost wordless. Watson poured his own cup, sat down, and waited. Holmes began with the envelopes themselves, which Watson might have predicted had he thought about it. Holmes never opened a thing before he had finished examining its outside. He lifted each envelope in turn, held it briefly to the lamplight, noted something about it, silently, for his own purposes, and set it in one of 3 groupings on the table. He worked without commentary for perhaps 10 minutes, which Watson spent in the very agreeable occupation of drinking his tea and listening to the fire. The coals had reached that particular stage of an evening fire where they produced more warmth than noise, glowing a deep, even orange, settling occasionally with a soft tick, radiating the kind of steady heat that made the idea of standing up feel unnecessarily ambitious. 3 categories, Holmes said at last, which was Watson's cue, to set down his cup and pay attention. Holmes gestured to each group in turn. The first, 8 letters, written on ordinary white paper of the sort sold at any stationer's, addressed in hands that are, individually, unremarkable, moderate literacy, careful but not educated penmanship, working people, most likely, or lower middle class. The paper has a faint smell of tallow in 2 of them, which suggests the writer worked or lived near a candlemaker or a chandler's shop. These are personal letters, apologies, I suspect, or explanations, the kind that are written late at night, and then not sent because the morning brings a different kind of courage. He moved to the second group. 5 letters, better paper, heavier, watermarked in one case. These writers had more money or more pretension, which is not always the same thing. The handwriting in 3 of them shows the particular cramped elegance of someone who was educated in a certain style, and has spent years trying to write faster than that education intended. The 4th is written by someone elderly. The pressure on the pen is inconsistent, the letters formed with effort. The 5th. He paused, picking up the blue-grey envelope. The heavier one Watson had noticed from the beginning. The 5th is different. Different how? Holmes turned the blue-grey envelope over. The seal on its back was intact, a different wax from the others, darker, the impression a simple geometric pattern rather than initials. The paper is continental, French, I believe. There is a faint blue tint to it, that comes from a particular sizing process used by 1 or 2 manufacturers in Lyon. The handwriting is English, but the habits are not entirely so. The pen pressure, the slight backward lean, this was written by someone who learned to write in English, but learned to think, perhaps, in another language. He set it down at a slight remove from the others. This one I will return to. He indicated the third group, 2 letters, set apart from the beginning. These 2, he said, and there was something in his voice that was quieter than the rest, were written by the same person. Watson leaned forward. The same hand? Not obviously. On the surface, no. One is small and neat, the other larger and less controlled. But look at the way the letter E is formed in both. He held them up, side by side. A particular habit. The final stroke lifts slightly, curls back. It is the kind of detail that survives even deliberate disguise, because it lives in the hand's muscle memory rather than the conscious mind. These were written by the same person attempting to appear as 2 different people. He set them down, which raises the question of why. Watson looked at the 3 groupings, 8, 5, 2, and then at the cracked seal sitting to one side, its broken halves still holding the impression of the initials AF. Which one is dangerous? He asked. Holmes looked at him with something that might, in a different man, have been called approval. That, he said, is exactly the right question, and I do not yet know the answer. He picked up his tea. We read. They began with the first group. Holmes read each letter with the focused, unhurried attention he gave to everything. Not quickly, not slowly, but at the pace the material required. He made no notes. His expression remained largely neutral, but Watson, who had spent years learning to read that neutrality, caught the small adjustments. A slight tightening around the eyes at something unexpected. A brief stillness when something confirmed a hypothesis. Once, just once, a faint softening that passed so quickly. Watson almost doubted he had seen it. The letters were, as Holmes had predicted, apologies. A woman apologizing to her sister for a slight delivered at a christening 12 years ago. A former shop assistant asking forgiveness from an employer he had misled. A man explaining to his adult son why he had not attended the boy's wedding. The explanation running to 4 pages, careful and painful and entirely unconvincing, in the way that very honest explanations sometimes are. An elderly woman writing to a neighbour who had, Watson gathered, moved away, or perhaps died. The letter gave no clear indication, and the uncertainty was somehow the saddest part of it. Watson read them as Holmes passed them across, and he found himself in the peculiar emotional position of being moved by correspondence that was not addressed to him, that he had no right to, that its authors had chosen, for whatever reason, not to send. There was something intimate about unread letters, something that felt like trespass. And yet the intimacy was different from what he expected, not raw or embarrassing, but very human in the way of small, specific details. The shop assistant who remembered the exact date he had told the lie, the woman who had replayed the christening slight so many times it had acquired the worn quality of a much-handled object. He was on the 4th letter of the first group, the elderly woman's letter to her neighbour, when he reached a passage that made him stop. He read it again. The woman had written, "I should have said at the time that I was sorry for what happened to your boy. I knew what it cost you, and I said nothing, because I did not know what words to use, and by the time I found them, it seemed too late to say them, and then too late became so long ago that it felt strange to disturb it. But silence is not the same as not caring. I hope you knew that. I think perhaps you did not. Watson set the letter down. He was aware, in a way he had not been a moment before, of the fire, and the warmth, and the particular quality of quietness in the room. He was aware of Holmes on the other side of the table, reading without looking up. He was aware of the fog at the window, and the distant bells, and the very solid, very present reality of Baker Street around him. He thought of a letter he had never written. He did not pursue the thought. He picked up his tea, found it had gone slightly cool, and drank it anyway. Holmes looked up. "Watson?" he said, and there was something careful in how he said it. Not curious, not analytical, but careful. "I'm quite all right," Watson said. Holmes looked at him for a moment longer, then returned to his reading. This was, Watson reflected, one of Holmes's less documented qualities, the ability to know when not to ask. They had reached the second group, the heavier paper, the more educated hands, when the door opened and Mycroft Holmes stepped into the room. He did so without knocking, which was not unusual for Mycroft, and without announcement, which meant Mrs. Hudson had either admitted him without coming upstairs first, or he had let himself in, which was not a capability Watson had previously known Mycroft to possess, and preferred not to think about too carefully. Mycroft Holmes was a large man, large in several senses simultaneously. He had his brother's grey eyes, and something of his brother's stillness, but where Sherlock's stillness was coiled, kinetic, a stopped spring, Mycroft's was architectural. He was still in the way that load-bearing walls are still, not restrained, but simply, massively, at rest. He wore evening dress, which suggested he had come from somewhere official, and he carried a folded paper in one hand, which he had not opened. "Sherlock," he said. Then, with the fractional adjustment of a man who has remembered that other people exist, "Watson." "Mycroft," Holmes said. He had not looked up from the letter in his hand. "You've been in Whitehall since 2 o'clock. The meeting ran late. There is chalk dust on your left cuff that does not match anything in your usual club rooms, which means you were in one of the smaller committee rooms on the second floor, where they have not yet replaced the old blackboard. You came here directly, which means you already know about the letters." Mycroft moved to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, the preferred position of a man who likes to observe a room, and looked at the table with its 3 groupings and its broken seal and its lengths of dark red ribbon. "The man who brought them," Mycroft said. "His name is Aldous Fenn. He operates a small stationery and copying shop in Clerkenwell. He has done so for approximately 30 years. He paused. "We have been aware of him for some time." "We," Holmes said, which wasn't a question, but functioned as one. "Certain parties," Mycroft said, which was his standard formulation for things he considered adequately explained. "Mr. Fenn is not, himself, a dangerous man. He is, in fact, rather the opposite, a man who has spent several decades being careful and quiet and largely invisible. The difficulty," he continued, and here his voice shifted by a fraction, still even, still measured, but carrying the particular weight of someone who is being precise, because imprecision would be costly, is one of the recipients. Holmes set down the letter. He was looking at Mycroft now. "One of these letters," Mycroft said, is addressed to a man named Calder. I will not give you his other details at this stage. What I will tell you is that Calder is not to be approached directly. Not by you, not by Watson, not by anyone not already known to him in a specific capacity. If that letter reaches him through unofficial channels, it will create a problem that is considerably larger than the letter itself. The fire clicked. The fog was a steady amber presence at the window. Watson looked at the blue-grey envelope, sitting at its slight remove from the others, and thought about continental paper and hands that had learned to write in English, but think in another language. "Is he the blackmailer?" Holmes asked. Mycroft's expression did not change, which was itself an answer. Then the letter addressed to him, Holmes said slowly, is the bait. "It is possible," Mycroft said, "that Mr. Fenn has been rather cleverer than he appears. It is also possible that he has been rather more reckless than he intended." He tucked the folded paper, which he had never opened, into his breast pocket. "I trust you will be careful, Sherlock." "I am always careful," Holmes said. Mycroft looked at him with the expression of an older brother who has a great deal of evidence to the contrary, and has made his peace with not presenting it. "Good evening, Watson," he said, and then, as quietly as he had arrived, he left. The door clicked shut. Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes looked at the blue-grey envelope. The fire settled with a soft sound, and the tea on the tray had long since gone cold, and outside the fog lay over Baker Street like a held breath, patient and thorough, and entirely indifferent to the small, careful drama being assembled on the table inside. "Well," Watson said. "Indeed," said Holmes. He reached for the blue-grey envelope, turned it once in his hands, and set it to the side, face down, as though giving it a moment's privacy. "We begin in the morning," he said. "There is a stationer's shop in Clerkenwell that I should very much like to see." Morning came to Baker Street the way it often did in November, reluctantly and without much conviction. The fog had thinned overnight, but not departed. It lingered in the lower parts of the street, hugging the pavement and the iron railings and the bases of the lamp-posts with the stubborn affection of something that knows it is not entirely welcome, but has nowhere else to be. The light was the colour of old pewter, flat, even, neither warm nor cold, the kind of light that made distances uncertain, and gave the familiar an unfamiliar quality, as though Baker Street had been copied out by someone who had seen it once and was working largely from memory. Holmes was already dressed when Watson came downstairs. This was not remarkable in itself. Holmes kept hours that bore no consistent relationship to the conventions of polite society. But he was dressed with a particular deliberateness that Watson recognized. Not his usual indoor informality, not the studied eccentricity he occasionally deployed for effect, but the practical, anonymous clothes of a man who intended to move through the city without attracting attention. Dark coat, unremarkable hat, the kind of boots that said nothing about their wearer, which in London was itself a kind of disguise. He was standing at the table, looking at the letters. Not at all of them. At the blue-grey envelope specifically, which he had turned face up again at some point in the night. He had not opened it. Watson could see the seal was still intact, the dark wax unbroken, the geometric impression undisturbed. "You didn't sleep," Watson said. "I slept adequately," Holmes said, which meant he had slept for perhaps 3 hours. and considered this sufficient, which Watson had long since stopped arguing with. "Eat something before we go. Mrs. Hudson has left things on the sideboard, and she will know if you don't." Watson was reasonably certain Mrs. Hudson would have no way of knowing whether he had eaten or not, but he ate anyway, because the eggs were there, and the morning was cold, and Clerkenwell was not a short walk. They took a cab as far as Farringdon Road and walked the rest. Holmes preferred to walk the final approach to any location he intended to examine. He said, when pressed, that it allowed him to read the neighbourhood before the neighbourhood had a chance to read him, to understand the rhythm of the streets, the density of foot traffic, the relationship between the buildings, the small signs that told you what kind of place you were entering. Watson had heard this explanation several times and believed it was true as far as it went. But he also suspected that Holmes simply liked walking, and found the explanation more professionally defensible than the preference. Clerkenwell in the morning was a neighbourhood in the process of beginning its working day with the concentrated, unsentimental energy of a place that had things to do. It was not a wealthy district, and it did not pretend to be. The buildings were practical, the shop-fronts modest, the streets busy with the kind of traffic that carried goods rather than people. Carts laden with paper and cloth and raw materials moving between the small workshops and manufactories that formed the economic backbone of the area. Clerkenwell had been a place of making for centuries. Clockmakers, jewellers, printers, bookbinders, and the air had a particular quality that Watson always associated with it, a mixture of metal and ink and the faint sweetness of sawdust that seemed to seep from the very walls. The fog was thinner here than in Baker Street, or perhaps it simply felt thinner, because the streets were narrower and the activity denser. The fog had less room to settle. Gas lamps were still lit on the longer stretches, their flames burning with the slightly diminished quality of lamps that had been going all night and were approaching the end of their patience. A woman sold hot chestnuts from a brazier at the corner of a small court, the smoke rising straight up in the still air. Two boys in identical caps were arguing with great seriousness over the ownership of a length of rope. Holmes walked without appearing to look at anything, which meant he was looking at everything. Fenn's shop was on a narrow street that ran between two larger ones, the kind of street that existed in Clerkenwell in considerable numbers. Connecting streets, passage streets, streets that were primarily useful for getting from one place to another, and had accumulated small businesses in the way that convenient locations accumulate things, gradually, practically, without any particular intention. The sign above the door read, A. Fenn, Stationer and Copyist, established 1861, in gold letters that had once been bright, and were now pleasantly faded, the gilt wearing to a warm amber at the edges. The window displayed the usual assortment of a stationer's shop: rolls of paper, bottles of ink in several colours, a selection of pen nibs fanned out on a card, a small stack of ledger books with marbled covers. It was a window that communicated competence and modest reliability rather than ambition, which Watson found, in context, rather poignant. The door was closed. A small card in the window read, "Closed, return Monday," but the card had been placed in the window at an angle, slightly askew, in a way that suggested it had been put there in haste. Holmes looked at the card for a moment. Then he crouched down. Watson followed his gaze to the base of the door, and there, half beneath the doorstep, as though it had been slid under the door from inside and then pushed slightly further out by the door's draught when it was opened and closed, was a key. It was a small key, iron rather than brass, the kind used for interior locks. It lay on the damp stone with the particular stillness of something that had been placed rather than dropped. No skid mark, no tumble, just a neat, deliberate placement at an angle that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking. Holmes did not pick it up immediately. He studied it where it lay, his eyes moving over it with the same methodical attention he had given the letters the previous evening. Then he straightened, took a pair of thin gloves from his coat pocket, put them on, and crouched again to lift it. "Cold," he said, "but not wet. It has been here since before the morning damp, but after last night's fog cleared enough to keep the step from being thoroughly soaked. Placed here between, I would estimate, midnight and 4 in the morning." He turned it over. "It is the key to this door." "Fenn left it," Watson said. "Fenn left it," Holmes agreed. He stood, looked at the key, looked at the door, and then, with the minimal ceremony of a man who has decided that a door is more useful open than shut, put the key in the lock and turned it. The shop was dim and smelled of ink and paper and something else underneath, something faintly herbal, medicinal, the ghost of a cough preparation or a tincture, the kind of smell that clings to a room where someone unwell has been spending time. Holmes stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, which was his habit. One last look at the whole before the parts demanded attention. Watson stood beside him and did the same, though he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that he was seeing a dim shop while Holmes was reading a document. The front of the shop was as it should be: counter, display cases, shelves of stock. The small desk behind the counter where the copyist worked, its surface clean, but bearing the slight roughness of long use, the wood worn smooth. In the places where papers had been slid back and forth for 30 years. There was a stool. There was a lamp, unlit. There was a small framed certificate on the wall. Watson could not read it from where he stood, and beside it a photograph of a street Watson did not recognize, taken in the flat grey light of an overcast day. Holmes moved to the desk and opened the single drawer with the unhurried assurance of a man who has already concluded that whatever is in the drawer is meant to be found. Inside was a ledger, not a shop ledger, not an accounts book or a record of orders. Watson could see, even from across the counter, that the pages were covered in a careful, deliberate hand, the entries not in columns, but in continuous prose, each one headed by a name. Some entries were long, a quarter page or more. Some were a single sentence. The most recent entry, the page lay open as though it had been left that way deliberately, was dated 4 days ago and read, in its entirety, "All delivered to B.S. as discussed with myself. The key is under the step. The matter of C.I. leave to better hands. I am sorry for the trouble." A.F. Holmes read it twice. Then he looked at Watson. "B.S.," Watson said. "Baker Street." He had planned this, Holmes said quietly. This was not an impulse. He has been planning this, perhaps for some time. He closed the ledger, then reconsidered, and opened it again, riffling back through the earlier pages with careful speed. "These are records. Every letter, every sender, every recipient. He has been holding these letters for Watson, some of these entries are dated years ago. 5 years. 8. One is dated 1879. The number settled in the room with the same weight as the smell of tincture and old paper. Watson looked around the dim shop, at the shelves of stock, the worn desk, the photograph on the wall, and tried to assemble from it a picture of the man who had stood here for 30 years, taking in other people's unfinished business, holding it carefully, and then, for some reason, at some specific moment, deciding that it was time for it to go somewhere. He collected them, Watson said. It wasn't quite the right word, but it was the nearest one available. People brought them to him, Holmes said, still reading. He was a copyist. People came to him with sensitive correspondence, documents they needed copied or drafted or witnessed. And sometimes they brought him letters they had written and could not send, and asked him to hold them, or to post them, or to destroy them, and he... Holmes stopped. He had reached an entry near the back of the ledger, and his expression had acquired that particular quality of focused stillness that meant something had confirmed something else. He kept them. For 30 years. For 30 years. Holmes closed the ledger. He picked it up. We are taking this. He looked once more around the shop, at the desk, the lamp, the framed certificate, the photograph. Then his gaze moved to the floor behind the counter, where Watson now noticed a second detail he had missed on first look. A small wooden crate, empty, lined with the same dark red ribbon that had tied the bundle of letters. The crate that had held them, before they were wrapped, before they were carried to Baker Street, before the old man with good boots had climbed the steps of 221B and handed them to Mrs. Hudson, and then walked away quickly, apologetically, without giving his name. Holmes stood with the ledger under his arm and the key in his gloved hand, and looked at the empty crate for a long moment. He is not simply missing, Holmes said at last. He has gone somewhere, deliberately, carefully. A pause. A man who arranges things this thoroughly is a man who is running out of time to arrange them. Outside, the November morning continued its grey, unhurried business. The chestnut seller's smoke rose straight and thin into the still air. The two boys had resolved their argument about the rope and moved on. The gas lamps were going out one by one as the day, such as it was, brightened enough to make them unnecessary. Watson followed Holmes out of the shop. Holmes locked the door behind them and put the key in his pocket. Not the keyring pocket, Watson noticed, but the inner breast pocket, where he kept things he considered important. They walked back toward Farringdon Road in silence, and Watson thought about 30 years of unfinished business, wrapped in dark red ribbon, waiting in a wooden crate in a dim shop on a connecting street in Clerkenwell. And he thought about the entry in the ledger, the matter of C. I leave to better hands, and he thought that whoever C was, whatever the matter was, Aldous Fenn had been carrying it for a very long time. And he was glad, quietly and without entirely meaning to be, that it had been brought to Baker Street. They did not open the blue-grey envelope immediately upon returning to Baker Street. This was Holmes's decision, communicated not by words, but by the way he set the envelope down on the table when they came in, deliberately, at a slight remove from the ledger, as though establishing that the two objects required separate consideration, and then crossed to his armchair and sat down and looked at the ceiling. Watson had learned, over the years, to read this particular posture. It did not mean Holmes was idle. It meant he was working in the way that produced no visible output, assembling things internally that were not yet ready to be spoken aloud, following a thread of reasoning through rooms Watson could not enter. So Watson put the kettle on, which was a reasonable thing to do at 10:30 on a cold November morning after a walk through Clerkenwell. And while it heated, he sat at the table with the ledger and read. Fenn's handwriting in the ledger was the same careful, deliberate hand as the address on the brown paper parcel, the hand of a man who wrote with intention rather than fluency, each letter formed with the self-conscious neatness of someone who had taught himself a skill, and respected it accordingly. The entries were dated and named, and they were, as Holmes had said, records. But they were also, Watson realized as he read further, something more than that. They were a kind of history. The earliest entry was from 1874, a letter brought in by a woman named M. Hartley, described only as a seamstress from Bermondsey, who had given Fenn a letter addressed to her estranged brother, and asked him to post it when she felt ready, and had never come back to say that she was. Fenn had kept the letter. He had noted in the entry that the woman had cried when she handed it over, and that she had apologized for crying, and that he had told her there was no need. That last detail, that small, specific detail, stopped Watson for a moment. He turned pages. 1878. A retired schoolmaster from Islington. 1881. A young clerk who had borrowed money from his employer, and wanted to confess but could not face the conversation. 1883. A woman who had written to her daughter's husband after her daughter's death, explaining things the daughter had not been able to say herself. Each entry noted the letter's provenance, its approximate contents as Fenn understood them, the reason it hadn't been sent. Some of the reasons were practical. The recipient had moved, had died, could not be located. Most were not practical at all. Most were the ordinary reasons that unsent letters accumulate in ordinary lives: fear, shame, the paralysis of caring too much about how the words would land, the slow calcification of too much time passing. Watson was reading the 1886 entries when Holmes spoke from his armchair without changing his position. "The letter from Calder," he said. "It is not addressed to Calder. It is addressed to Fenn." Watson looked up. "Calder wrote to Fenn," Holmes continued, still looking at the ceiling. "Not the other way around, and Fenn kept it, not because he couldn't bear to send a reply, but because the letter itself was a threat, a very carefully constructed threat, wrapped in the language of old acquaintance." He paused. "Find the entry." Watson turned to the back of the ledger, where the most recent entries were. He found the entry for Calder 3 pages from the end, longer than most, written in a slightly different ink that suggested it had been added to over time rather than composed at a single sitting. He read it. Then he read it again. "Holmes?" he said. "Yes." "Fenn has known Calder for, this says 31 years. They were in business together, briefly, in the early 1860s, a small printing concern." Watson scanned the entry. Fenn made a mistake. The entry doesn't specify what kind. He writes only that he acted wrongly in a matter of trust, and that Calder was aware of it. He believed Calder had forgiven him, or at least forgotten. Then, 5 years ago, Calder wrote. And the letter? It was not a demand, not directly. It was, Fenn describes it as a letter that said nothing, and implied everything. It mentioned the old business. It mentioned certain records. It expressed a hope that Fenn was prospering, and indicated that Calder himself had recently come into a position of some influence. Watson set the ledger down. And then it ended with the sentence. Here, Fenn has quoted it directly. "I trust we understand each other as men of the world, and that there is no need for old misunderstandings to be revisited." The fire ticked. The kettle, which Watson had entirely forgotten, had been boiling for some time, and was filling the kitchen end of the room with a faint, hissing insistence. He got up and dealt with it mechanically, his mind still in the ledger entry. He kept the letter as evidence, Holmes said, in case Calder ever moved from implication to explicit demand. He knew that, if it came to that, a letter in Calder's own hand, establishing the nature of the relationship and the implicit threat, would be of some value. A pause. And he kept it here, in his shop, in his ledger, for 5 years, hidden in plain sight among 30 years of other people's unsent correspondence. Watson brought the tea to the table. He sat down. "And now he's sent it to you." "He's sent it to me," Holmes said. He unfolded himself from the armchair, with the unhurried movement of a decision being enacted, and crossed to the table and picked up the blue-grey envelope. He held it for a moment, not examining it this time, simply holding it, with the weight of what was inside it now understood. "He has sent it to me because he is running out of time, and he knows he cannot handle Calder himself, and because—" He stopped. "Because he trusts you," Watson said. Holmes set the envelope down. "He has never met me," he said, but the observation was quieter than it might have been, and Watson let it rest where it landed. Holmes did not open the envelope that afternoon. Instead, he sent 3 telegrams. Watson was not shown their contents, and spent an hour with the ledger, making his own notes in the small, precise handwriting that he used when he was building something, rather than recording it. Watson read and drank tea and watched the fog press against the windows as the afternoon light began its early November retreat. It was at 3:30, when Holmes had gone to his room to review whatever responses the telegrams had produced, that Watson found himself alone at the table with the letters. The 2 groups had been left as Holmes had sorted them. Watson looked at them for a while without touching them. Then, almost without deciding to, he reached for the pile of 8, the ordinary white paper, the tallow smell, the working hands. He had read most of them the previous evening. But there was one he had not finished. The 4th letter, the elderly woman to her neighbour. He had stopped at the passage about silence not being the same as not caring, and set it down, and not returned to it. He returned to it now. The letter was 3 pages, written in a hand that was elderly but not infirm, the careful, upright hand of a woman who had been taught that presentation mattered, and had not forgotten the lesson even in her 80s, if she was in her 80s. Which Watson estimated she probably was, from the evidence of the letter itself. She had written to a woman named Clara, who had been her neighbour for, reading between the lines, 20 years or more, before Clara had moved away, following some unspecified family circumstance. The letter was not dramatic. It did not contain revelations or confessions. It was the kind of letter that would disappoint anyone expecting a mystery, and devastate anyone who had ever left something unsaid to someone they cared about. Watson read to the end this time. The final paragraph was this: "I kept meaning to write sooner, but the days run together. And then I wasn't sure you would want to hear from me after so long a silence. I know I am too late for most of what I wanted to say. But I am not yet too late for this, which is simply, you were a good neighbor, and I was glad of it. And I hope, wherever you are now, you have found a window with good light, as you always liked. Watson put the letter down on the table face down, the way Holmes had put down the blue-grey envelope, and sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. Outside, a cart passed with a sound of iron wheels on damp stone, slow and heavy. The fire had burned down to a steady glow. The clock on the mantel marked the quarter hour with a soft, single note that dissolved into the room's warmth and was gone. He thought about letters he had not written, about people to whom he had meant to say things and had not said, for the same ordinary reasons as the seamstress from Bermondsey and the schoolmaster from Islington, because the time had passed, because he was not sure how the words would land, because silence had accumulated into a kind of habit, and habits were easier to continue than to break. He did not pursue these thoughts very far. They were not comfortable thoughts. But he let them sit for a moment in the warm, quiet room before he set them aside with the deliberate gentleness of someone putting something fragile back on a shelf. He turned the elderly woman's letter back over. He looked at the address on the front. He thought, this one, at least, can still be delivered. Holmes came back into the room at 4 o'clock with 3 telegrams folded in his breast pocket, and a particular quality of focused calm that meant the shape of something had become clear to him. He looked at Watson and at the letter in Watson's hand and said nothing. Watson set the letter down. Mycroft can handle Calder. Mycroft, Holmes said, has already begun handling Calder in the way that Mycroft handles things, quietly, entirely, and in a manner that will leave Calder in no doubt that the leverage he believed he held has been removed without the removal ever being discussed. He sat down. The blue-grey envelope will be used, but not by us, and not in any courtroom. It will simply cease to be a threat. That is Mycroft's gift. He does not defeat people so much as make certain positions untenable. And Fenn, Holmes said, is in Southwark. Watson looked up. A boarding-house on Bankside. He's been there for 4 days. Holmes picked up his tea, found it cold, and drank it anyway in the manner of a man with other priorities. He is ill, Watson. Not dangerously so, not immediately, but ill in the way that makes a man want to settle his affairs. A pause. He did not want to be found yet, but the ledger was more specific than he intended, and I am more thorough than he perhaps anticipated. The fire had burned low. Watson leaned forward and added a piece of coal from the scuttle, and the fire accepted it and began its slow work of incorporating it, and the room grew incrementally warmer. All the letters, Watson said, every one of them, he wanted them delivered. Yes, that's why he sent them here, not just because of Calder, because he needed someone who would actually do it. Watson looked at the 3 groupings on the table. 8, 5, 2. Someone who would take them seriously. Holmes looked at the letters for a long moment. Then he looked at Watson. We begin deliveries tomorrow, he said, all except the blue-grey envelope, which goes to Mycroft this evening. He stood. There are 14 letters, Watson, 14 addresses. Some of them will be straightforward, some will not, and one of them... He stopped and picked up the elderly woman's letter from where Watson had set it down, and looked at the address on the front. One of them, he he said more quietly, is to someone who has been waiting quite long enough. They began at 8 o'clock in the morning, which was earlier than Watson had expected, and later than Holmes had intended. The delay was Mrs. Hudson's doing, and it was entirely characteristic of her. She had appeared at the foot of the stairs at 7:30 with a paper bag in one hand, and an expression that communicated, without any accompanying words, that two grown men were not leaving this house to walk about London in November without something in their pockets. The bag contained 8 shortbread biscuits wrapped in paper, 2 apples, and a small folded note that read, in Mrs. Hudson's precise hand, in case you forget to stop. Holmes had accepted the bag with the slightly stunned expression of a man who has been outmanoeuvred by a landlady and knows better than to comment on it. Watson had said thank you, which Mrs. Hudson acknowledged with a nod of the sort that suggested thank you was the correct response, and she was glad someone in the household had thought of it. They took the bag. The morning was cold and clear in the way that November mornings sometimes managed. The fog had retreated, chased off by a thin wind from the east that had arrived overnight and was conducting itself with the brisk, purposeful energy of something that knew it would not last. The sky was a pale, washed blue above the rooftops, and the light had that particular quality of winter clarity that made everything look slightly more defined than usual. The edges of buildings sharper, the shadows bluer, the whole city appearing to have been recently and thoroughly washed. Holmes had arranged the deliveries in a sequence that Watson recognized from the ledger entries as being organized by geography, rather than by emotional weight, starting in Islington in the north and working south through Bloomsbury, then east toward Stepney, and finally west to the quieter streets near Paddington. It was a practical route, but Watson noticed, without remarking on it, that Holmes had placed the elderly woman's letter, the one addressed to Clara, with the window and the good light, third in the sequence, which was neither first nor last, but had the feeling of something positioned with care. They walked when the distances permitted it, which Holmes preferred. The streets in the early morning had a quality Watson always found agreeable. The working day just beginning, the city still in the process of assembling itself, the pavements busy but not yet crowded, the shop fronts opening one by one, the smell of bread from bakeries and coal smoke from newly lit fires combining in the cold air into something that was, taken together, rather comforting. Holmes carried the letters in his breast pocket. He had arranged them in their sequence and secured them with a piece of the dark red ribbon, not the original ribbon, which he had preserved along with the brown paper and the cracked seal, but a fresh length that Mrs. Hudson had produced from somewhere with the same inexplicable efficiency with which she produced everything else. The first delivery was in Islington, to a man named Graves, the retired schoolmaster Watson had noted in the ledger. The address was a modest terraced house on a quiet street near the Angel, the kind of street that had once been respectable and was now what estate agents would call characterful, which meant the paintwork was varied, and the front gardens held a democratic mixture of rose bushes and accumulated bicycles. Number 14 had a clean step and a recently polished knocker in the shape of a lion's head, which told Watson something useful about its occupant before the door opened. The man who answered was in his 70s, Watson estimated. Compact, precise, with the upright posture of a man who had spent 40 years telling young people to sit up straight and had internalized the instruction himself. He looked at Holmes and Watson with the cautious assessment of someone who did not get many unexpected callers and had learned to evaluate them before committing to anything. Holmes introduced himself simply, not with the full weight of his name and reputation, but plainly, as a man acting on behalf of another. He produced the letter and held it out. The schoolmaster looked at it. He looked at the handwriting on the envelope. Something happened to his face, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible from 10 feet away. But Watson was 4 feet away, and he saw it. A very small, very quick movement of the muscles around the eyes, the kind of movement that happens when something long since set aside is suddenly present again. He took the letter. "Thank you," he said. He said it to Holmes, and then, with a slight adjustment, to Watson as well. Then he closed the door, not abruptly, but with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who needed to be alone with something. They stood on the step for a moment in the cold morning air. "Right," said Watson. "Yes," said Holmes, and they walked on. The second delivery was in Bloomsbury, and it was less straightforward. The address was a rooming house near the British Museum, a tall, thin building with a narrow door, and a landlady who answered it with the specific combination of suspicion and authority that Watson associated with landladies who had been lied to by a significant proportion of their tenants, and had adjusted their priors accordingly. When Holmes asked for a Mr. de Lacy, she informed him that Mr. de Lacy did not live there, had never lived there, and that if they were associates of Mr. de Lacy, she had several things to say to them on behalf of 2 months' unpaid rent. Holmes thanked her with perfect courtesy, replaced the letter in his pocket, and consulted the ledger entry he had copied onto a folded card before leaving Baker Street. He stood on the pavement outside the rooming house for approximately 40 seconds, during which time Watson ate one of Mrs. Hudson's shortbread biscuits and watched him think. "The address has changed," Holmes said at last. "But the letter was written 4 years ago, and the ledger entry is 3 years old. He has moved." He looked at the street. "He worked, near the museum. The letter mentions proofs and typesetting errors, which means he was in printing or publishing. The British Museum is flanked on its eastern side by a number of small publishers and print shops." He began walking. "We will find him." They did, eventually, in a print shop on Museum Street, now a compositor rather than a lodger, a younger man than Watson had imagined, with ink-stained fingers and the slightly distracted expression of someone whose mind was perpetually on a different page from the one currently in front of him. He received the letter with visible confusion, examined the handwriting, and then looked up with an expression that Watson found difficult to categorize. Not quite recognition, not quite relief, but something in the territory between them. "My mother wrote this," he said. "We believe so," Holmes said. The young man turned the letter over. The seal was intact, as all the seals were, Holmes having decided without discussion that the letters would be delivered as they were, unread by their recipients until they chose to open them. "She died 2 years ago," he said. I didn't know there was a letter." He looked at Holmes. Holmes met his gaze steadily, without the discomfort that Watson suspected most people would feel in that moment. "I'm sorry for your loss," Holmes said simply. And then, because there was nothing more useful to add, they excused themselves and left. Watson did not speak until they had turned the corner back onto Great Russell Street. "Does it always—" he began, and then stopped, because he was not entirely sure how the sentence ended. "No," said Holmes, which was, Watson reflected, not quite an answer, and also entirely sufficient. The elderly woman's letter was third. The address was in Clerkenwell. Not far, Watson realized, from Fenn's shop on its narrow connecting street. A small ground-floor flat in a brick building that had once been something else, a warehouse or a small factory, converted into dwellings in a manner that retained the high ceilings and the wide windows of its industrial past, and gave the flats inside an unexpectedly airy quality. The name on the door was not Clara. Clara was the recipient, not the current occupant. The woman who answered was perhaps 50, with the slightly guarded expression of someone who is not sure whether unexpected callers constitute good news or bad. Holmes asked carefully whether she knew the previous occupant of the flat or any forwarding information. The woman considered. "The lady before me was named Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "She moved. Oh, it must be 6 years ago now. Her daughter came to collect her. I believe she went to live with them, somewhere south of the river, I think. Peckham, perhaps." She paused. She was a lovely woman, very particular about her windows. Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes looked at Watson. "Very particular about her windows," Watson repeated. "She liked the light," the woman confirmed. "She always said she needed a window with good light." They took down what details the woman had, thanked her, and Holmes noted the information on his card. The letter remained in his pocket, its sequence temporarily interrupted, but its delivery not abandoned, merely rerouted to be managed through other channels once the Peckham address was confirmed. The afternoon deliveries took them east, toward Stepney, and the city changed around them as they went. The Georgian composure of Bloomsbury giving way to the denser, more various streetscape of the East End, the buildings lower and more irregular, the streets narrower, the atmosphere busier and less self-conscious. Watson had always found the East End more immediately alive than the western districts, noisier, certainly, and less orderly, but possessed of a vitality that the quieter streets sometimes lacked, a sense that a great deal of living was being conducted in a small amount of space, and that everyone had reached an accommodation with this circumstance. It was in Stepney, on a street of small shops near the commercial road, that they encountered the doorman. He was not, strictly speaking, a doorman. He was the proprietor of a small ironmonger's, a broad and magnificently moustached man of perhaps 60, who occupied the space in front of his own shop, with the territorial confidence of a man who considered the pavement immediately outside his premises to be an extension of his personal domain. The letter was for the occupant of the flat above the ironmonger's, accessible via a side door, a door that the ironmonger had apparently decided, without any formal appointment to this role, to consider within his purview. "You'll want Mr. Sabo," he said when Holmes explained what they were looking for, with the emphasis of a man who has pronounced this name many times and considers himself its definitive authority. "He's upstairs. He doesn't take callers before 11. He looked at them with the assessing eye of a border official. "Are you expected?" "We are not," Holmes said pleasantly. "He doesn't take unexpected callers before noon." "I see," Holmes considered. "And afternoon?" "He doesn't encourage them." There was a pause during which Holmes and the ironmonger regarded each other with mutual, entirely courteous intractability. Watson became aware that he was eating the second of Mrs. Hudson's shortbread biscuits, and that this was perhaps not the most authoritative thing to be doing. "We have a letter," Holmes said, "for Mr. Sabo. It is from someone he knew some years ago. It is not bad news. Or rather, it is not new bad news. It is old news that has been waiting to reach him for some time." He produced the envelope. "If you would be so good as to ensure he receives it, we need not trouble him at an inconvenient hour." The ironmonger looked at the envelope. He looked at Holmes. He looked at Watson, who had finished the biscuit and was endeavouring to look reliable. "He'll want to know who it's from," the ironmonger said, with the manner of a man making a tactical concession. "The name on the back is A. Fenn," Holmes said. "He will know it." The ironmonger took the envelope with the careful movement of a man accepting a responsibility he intends to discharge properly. "Right," he said. "I'll see. He gets it." "Thank you," said Holmes, and tipped his hat, with a gravity that Watson suspected was approximately 10% genuine and 90% strategic, and they walked on. Watson waited until they had rounded the corner before speaking. "That," he said, "was the proudest man I have encountered this calendar year. He has held that patch of pavement for 22 years, Holmes said, without going from pale blue to the particular deep grey that preceded a November dusk. Gas lamps were being lit along the wider streets, the lamplighters moving in their steady, practised circuit, each lamp catching and blooming into its small sphere of amber warmth. They had delivered 9 letters. 5 remained, including the elderly woman's letter, temporarily suspended, and the 2 written by the same hand in 2 different disguises, which Holmes had set aside for separate consideration. Watson's feet were reporting their opinions of a full day's walking with the patient persistence of a constituency that has been ignored too long. He said nothing about this, because Holmes showed no signs of the same complaint, and there was a certain dignity to be maintained. But when Holmes stopped at the corner of a quiet street in Paddington, and said, without preamble, "There is a tea shop on the next block that is adequate," Watson experienced a relief he considered entirely proportionate to the circumstances. They sat at a small table by a window that looked out onto the darkening street, and Watson drank his tea with the uncomplicated gratitude of a man who has earned it, and Holmes looked out at the lamps being lit one by one along the pavement, and neither of them spoke for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. 9 delivered, Watson said eventually. 9, Holmes agreed. How many went well? Holmes considered. That depends on what you mean by well. Watson thought about the schoolmaster and his door closing quietly, the compositor with the ink-stained hands, the ironmonger accepting his responsibility with ceremony. I mean, did they land where they were supposed to? Letters always land where they are supposed to, Holmes said. He was still watching the lamps. The question is only whether the person receiving them is ready for them. A pause. Most of them were. Outside, the lamplighter reached the corner lamp and touched it to life, and the small circle of amber light expanded outward and steadied, and the street became, in its small way, a little warmer. "Tomorrow," Holmes said, "we go to Southwark." Southwark in the morning had a different quality from the rest of London. It was not a poorer quality, exactly, nor a harder one. though Southwark was both of those things in places, and had been for centuries, in the way of districts that sit just south of a river that carries all the money northward. It was more that Southwark seemed to exist at a slight remove from the city's self-consciousness. The other districts, Mayfair with its careful elegance, Bloomsbury with its cultivated restraint, even the East End with its defiant vitality, all seemed aware of themselves, aware of what they were supposed to be and what impression they were supposed to make. Southwark simply was. It had been a place of theatres, and bear pits, and debtors' prisons, and tanneries, and all the things the City of London preferred to conduct at a distance, and it had survived all of them, and the survival had given it a quality of undemonstrative permanence that Watson always found, despite himself, rather calming. The Thames was visible between buildings as they crossed Borough High Street, a wide, grey, entirely indifferent presence, moving with the patient authority of something that has been moving in the same direction since before the city existed, and intends to continue after it is gone. The tide was out, which left a dark margin of exposed riverbank below the embankment wall, the mud catching the thin morning light with a dull, pewter gleam. Holmes knew the street they wanted, which Watson had stopped finding surprising. Holmes had an internal map of London that was more comprehensive and more peculiarly detailed than any published version. He knew not just the streets, but their characters, their histories, the particular populations they attracted, and why. Bankside, he had explained on the cab ride over, was a district of small lodging houses that catered to a specific kind of tenant. People who needed to be near the centre of the city for practical reasons, but could not afford or did not desire the more conspicuous districts. Clerks, minor tradesmen, people in transition between one circumstance and another, people who wanted, for whatever reason, to be somewhere quiet and unremarked. People, Watson thought, who were settling their affairs. The boarding house was a narrow building on a street that ran parallel to the river, close enough that the smell of the Thames was present in the air, not unpleasantly so, not the summer stench that could make Bankside genuinely difficult, but the winter version, cold water and mud and the faint mineral smell of things that had been in the river sea long time. The building had 4 floors and a clean front step, and a landlady who answered the door with the brisk, unsurprised manner of a woman who had seen a great variety of callers, and organized them efficiently into categories before they had finished their first sentence. Holmes asked for Mr. Fenn. The landlady looked at them both, a rapid, professional assessment, and said that Mr. Fenn was on the 3rd floor, and had asked not to be disturbed, and that he had been asking not to be disturbed for 4 days, though she had been bringing him soup regardless, because he was clearly unwell, and she was not operating an establishment where people were allowed to simply not eat. He is expecting us, Holmes said, in the sense that he arranged for us to find him. The landlady considered this. 3rd floor, she said. Knock twice. He doesn't always hear the first one. The room was small and south-facing, which meant it caught whatever light the November sky was willing to provide, and on this particular morning that was a modest but genuine amount. A pale, even illumination that came through the single window and lay across the floor and the foot of the bed with the quality of winter light that asks nothing of you and simply exists, which Watson had always found more restful than the brighter, more demanding light of summer. Aldous Fenn was sitting in a chair by the window. Watson's first assessment was clinical and immediate, as it always was when he entered a room and found someone ill. The man was thin, as Mrs. Hudson had said, spare by nature. But the thinness had a recent addition to it, the particular concavity of someone who had been eating less than they needed for longer than was advisable. His colour was poor, not dramatically so, not the alarming pallor of acute illness, but the dull, washed-out colour of chronic fatigue, of a body that had been running on reduced resources for some time and had adjusted its expectations accordingly. His breathing, Watson noted, was slightly shallow. His hands, resting in his lap, were steady. He was perhaps 65. He looked, Watson thought, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had recently set it down, and was still in the process of understanding what his arms felt like without it. He looked at Holmes first, then at Watson, with an expression that was not surprise. "You found the ledger," he said. His voice was quieter than Watson had imagined, not weak, but considered, the voice of a man who had learned to be careful with words, and applied that carefulness even now. "I found the ledger," Holmes said. Fenn nodded. He looked at the window for a moment, at the pale light and the rooftops and the thin strip of grey sky. "I wasn't sure whether to include it. It felt incomplete without it. But it also felt like an imposition." He paused. "I've been imposing on people for 30 years, I suppose. What's one more?" "You haven't been imposing," Watson said, which came out more immediately than he had intended. But Fenn looked at him with what might have been the beginning of a grateful expression. So he continued. "The people who brought you those letters were making a choice. They needed somewhere to put them." "They needed a postbox that didn't post," Fenn said, with a dry, quiet humour that suggested he had arrived at this description some years ago, and found it adequate. Holmes had taken the chair on the other side of the small table near the window. He sat with his hands clasped and his attention fully present, which was the particular quality Watson associated with Holmes when he was listening rather than deducing, a different kind of attention, less kinetic, more patient. "Tell me about Calder," Holmes said. Fenn was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cart passed on the street below, with the slow, heavy sound of iron wheels on damp stone, and the sound rose and fell and was absorbed by the general quietness of the morning. The river smell was faint in the room, but present, like a reminder. "I was 22, Fenn said, "when I met Calder. He had a printing business, small, not yet established. He needed a partner who understood paper and materials. I did. I had worked for a stationer since I was 14. He paused. "I was good at what I did. I was not always good at what I was." He said this with the matter-of-fact tone of a man who has had a long time to look at something from a distance and has arrived at precision rather than self-pity. "There were certain orders," he continued, "documents. Calder did not ask questions about what was being copied and for whom, and he did not encourage me to ask either. I understood eventually what some of them were. Forged provenance papers, documents of title that were not what they claimed to be." A pause. "I was young. I needed the money. I told myself these were ordinary reasons. They were ordinary reasons. That does not make them good ones." "You stopped," Holmes said. "I stopped," Fenn confirmed. "I left the business. Calder bought out my share. We parted, not warmly, but without incident. I opened my own shop. I spent the next 30 years being careful and honest, which felt like, not penance exactly, but a kind of discipline, a way of being that I chose deliberately, every day, because I knew what the alternative looked like. He looked at his hands. I thought it was enough. And then Calder wrote, Holmes said. Calder wrote, Fenn said, 5 years ago. He had done well. He was well positioned, as the letter said, connected. And he wanted me to know that he remembered. He looked at Holmes directly. He didn't ask for money. He never asked for anything directly. That was the cleverness of it. He simply wanted me to know that he knew, and that he was close, and that the knowing was enough. "Why did you keep the letter?" Watson asked. Fenn looked at him with the slight surprise of someone who has been asked the question they were expecting, but not quite yet. Because I understood, eventually, that silence was what he wanted. My silence, my continued good behaviour, enforced not by anything said, but by the permanent possibility of something being said. He paused. I am a man who has spent 30 years understanding the weight of things that are not sent. I know what silence costs. I decided, eventually, that I would not pay it indefinitely. The room was quiet for a moment. Holmes said, "The letter will not reach him. Mycroft has ensured that." Fenn looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not with the theatrical relief of a man in a story, but with the small, genuine adjustment of a man who has been carrying a specific weight and has just been told, credibly, that he can set it down. "Good," he said simply. They sat for a while, the three of them, in the pale south-facing light of the small room, while Watson asked the practical questions that needed asking about Fenn's health, and Fenn answered them with the cooperative candour of a man who has decided to stop managing his own circumstances and allow someone else to assist. The illness was not acute, as Watson had assessed, a chronic fatigue of the lungs, complicated by age and the accumulated effect of a lifetime in shops where the dust of paper and tallow had been a constant presence. Not dangerous, with proper management. Manageable, with rest and the right conditions and the attention of a competent physician. Watson said so, clearly, and Fenn listened with the expression of a man receiving information he had half suspected and half resisted knowing, and then nodded once. "There are still letters undelivered," Holmes said after a while. "Yes," Fenn said. The two I wrote myself, one for each hand." Holmes looked at him steadily. "The same author, 2 different disguises." Fenn almost smiled. "You would find that." "The letters are addressed to 2 different people," Holmes said, "but they say the same thing." "They are apologies," Fenn said, "to 2 people I wronged. One before Calder, one after. I wrote them separately because I could not bear to write them together. It felt like making a list of oneself." He paused. "I wrote them in different hands because I was ashamed of each one knowing about the other. Which is—" he stopped. "Which is a very particular kind of foolishness." "It is a very human kind," Watson said. Fenn looked at him again. That same expression, the beginning of something grateful. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." Holmes reached into his breast pocket and produced the 2 letters, the ones with their matching telltale E, their careful disguises, their shared origin. He set them on the small table between them. Fenn looked at them for a long moment. "Will you deliver them?" he asked. "Yes," Holmes said. "They may not respond well." "That is possible," Holmes said. "It is also not the point. Fenn was quiet. Then he reached forward and touched the edge of one envelope, not picking it up, just touching it, with the particular gentleness of someone handling something they have been afraid of for a long time and have decided, finally, to stop being afraid of. "The ledger," Watson said gently. "The last entry. It said you were sorry for the trouble." Fenn made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "I am," he said. "It was a great deal to ask. Of a man I have never met." "You left a key under the step," Holmes said, with what Watson privately identified as the driest possible form of warmth. "I left a key under the step," Fenn agreed. He looked at Holmes. "You came." "I came," Holmes said. Watson handled the medical arrangements before they left. A note to a physician he trusted who practiced in the borough, a word with the landlady about soup and warmth, and the particular stubbornness of lung ailments in winter, a brief, firm conversation with Fenn himself about the difference between independent and isolated, and how only one of those was actually admirable. Fenn received this without argument, which Watson found more moving than if he had pushed back. Holmes, during this time, had taken the ledger from his coat and sat with it open at the last entry, all delivered to B.S. as discussed with myself. "The key is under the step. The matter of C I leave to better hands. I am sorry for the trouble. A.F., and written beneath it, in his own small, precise hand, a single line. Watson read it as they were leaving. It said, "The matter of C is resolved. The letters have found their way. S.H." He closed the ledger and left it on the table beside Fenn's chair, where Fenn would find it when they had gone. They walked back toward London Bridge in the thin winter light, the river visible and invisible between the buildings as the street curved, the city reassembling itself around them, with its usual indifference to the small, careful things being done within it. Watson thought about Fenn in his south-facing room, with his ledger and his good light, and his 30 years of careful, deliberate honesty. He thought about the 2 letters in Holmes's pocket, waiting for their deliveries. He thought about the elderly woman's letter, still suspended, its recipient somewhere in Peckham, with particular ideas about windows. "One more day," Holmes said, which was not quite what Watson had been thinking, but was close enough. "One more day," Watson agreed. Ahead of them, London Bridge stretched across the Thames in its solid, workaday fashion, the morning traffic moving across it in both directions, with the steady, unremarkable purposefulness of a city that had things to do. The river below was wide and grey and entirely itself. Watson put his hands in his coat pockets against the cold, and found the last of Mrs. Hudson's shortbread biscuits, wrapped in its paper, patient and forgotten. He ate it walking across the bridge, and it was, given everything, exactly what was needed. The last 2 letters were delivered on a Thursday. Watson didn't accompany Holmes for both of them. The first, to a woman in Lambeth who had received an apology she had not expected, and had stood in her doorway for a long moment before saying, very quietly, that she had wondered. Holmes managed alone in the morning, while Watson saw to some correspondence of his own that had been accumulating with the patient reproach of neglected things. The second delivery, to a man in Islington who had received the other of Fenn's 2 disguised letters, Holmes also managed alone. He said nothing about it when he returned to Baker Street at 2:30, except that it had gone adequately, which Watson understood to mean that it had gone as well as these things go, which was not the same as easily, but was enough. The elderly woman's letter reached Clara Whitmore in Peckham on the Friday, through a combination of Holmes's inquiries and the Southwark physician Watson had engaged, who knew the neighbourhood and the names within it, with the comprehensive familiarity of a man who had been making house calls there for 20 years. Watson did not learn the details of its reception. He preferred not to. Some things were complete, without being observed. By Friday evening, Baker Street had resumed its familiar character. The letters were gone, all of them, delivered or dispatched or resolved through Mycroft's quiet channels. The brown paper was folded on the mantelpiece, with the dark red ribbon beside it, and the cracked seal in its two halves, the initials A.F. still legible in the wax. Holmes had not thrown these away. Watson had not asked him to. The fire was well built, the coals recently added, the room warm with the steady, unhurried warmth of an evening with nowhere to be. Outside, the fog had returned. It was that kind of November, the fog treating Baker Street as a preferred address, arriving each evening with the comfortable familiarity of a regular guest. The gas lamp at the foot of the street glowed its usual amber through the murk. Somewhere in the middle distance, the bells of a church Watson had never successfully identified were marking the half-hour with their usual patient authority. Holmes was at the fireplace with his violin. He was not playing, exactly, not performing, not working through a composition with the focused intensity that sometimes occupied him for hours. He was doing the thing he did occasionally, the thing Watson had no adequate name for, drawing the bow across the strings slowly, producing single notes and small clusters of notes that had no particular melody, but had a quality of searching, perhaps, feeling the way forward through sound rather than thought. The notes rose and dissolved into the warm air of the room, and were replaced by others, unhurried, undemonstrative, entirely themselves. Watson was at, for him, but felt appropriate tonight. He for him, but felt appropriate tonight. He looked at the date. He looked at the fire. He looked at the two halves of the cracked seal on the mantelpiece, the broken AF catching the firelight in small, warm gleams. He thought about what to write. The case would not appear in the papers. Holmes had said this early on, almost in passing, in the way he said things that were decided rather than proposed. There was no crime to report, no arrest to announce, no villain apprehended, and no victim redeemed in any legible, publishable sense. What had happened was quieter than that, and more complete than that, and Watson was not sure the newspapers had a category for it. He wrote, "There are cases which leave no mark on the public record, and considerable mark on the private one." He looked at this sentence for a while. Then he wrote, "Fenn is recovering. The physician sends good reports. He has moved to a slightly larger room, still south-facing. He was particular about that, with better ventilation, and a landlady who appears to have adopted him with the firm, unsentimental affection of a woman who has decided someone is worth the trouble." He paused again. The violin produced a phrase, 4 notes, descending with a gentleness that was almost deliberate. And Holmes let it rest, and the room was quiet, except for the fire. Watson wrote, "I have been thinking about the letters, not the dangerous one, not the complicated ones, but the ordinary ones, the ones written by ordinary people to other ordinary people, across ordinary distances of time and pride and silence. I have been thinking about what it costs to write them, and what it costs not to. I have no conclusion. I am not sure conclusions are available on this particular question. He set down his pen. Holmes had moved to his armchair, the violin resting across his knees, the bow held loosely. He was looking at the fire with the quality of attention that was not deduction and not rest, but something in between. The look of a man whose mind has arrived temporarily at a comfortable and undemanding place. "Holmes," Watson said. Do you think he'll write again? Fen. After all this." Holmes considered. The fire ticked. The fog pressed softly at the glass. "I think," Holmes said at last, "that a man who has spent 30 years understanding the weight of unsent letters has probably learned something about the cost of sending them." A pause. "I think he will write exactly what needs to be written and send it, and not keep a copy." Watson thought about this. That sounds like a good way to live. "It sounds like an exhausting way to live," Holmes said. "But, yes, a good one." Mrs. Hudson brought supper at 8 o'clock. Nobody had asked for it, which was entirely characteristic, and set it on the side table with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a ceremony they consider important, and withdrew without comment, pulling the door softly closed. The room settled around the food and the fire and the fog at the window. Watson served 2 plates without being asked. Holmes accepted his without looking up, which was thanks in the currency they had always used between them. The key from Fenn's shop sat on the mantelpiece beside the ribbon and the cracked seal. It was no longer a clue. It was no longer evidence of anything except the fact that a careful, quiet man had decided, at the end of a long time, to trust someone with the things he could not carry alone. Watson looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his fork, and the fire burned steadily. And outside London settled into its Friday night, the fog thickening, the lamps glowing, the streets quieting one by one as the city turned inward toward warmth and rest. And at 221 B. Baker Street, as at a great many addresses, across the city that evening, the day drew to its close in the particular piece of things that have been said and sent and received. Everyone, in their own way and their own time, slept a little easier.